Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. I am Napah Shadah, and today we have a very wonderful, esteemed guest. He's back with us, Dr. Dale C. Allison. Welcome, Dr. Allison.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be back.
Yes, Dr. Allison, if you did not see our last interview, is Princeton's Theological Seminary's professor of New Testament. And he also does historical research on Jesus and the New Testament. He's written several books, some of which are Jesus, the Resurrection of Jesus, Night Comes, that's one of my favorites. And we are going to be actually talking to Dr. Allison about his latest piece, Encountering Mystery, Religious Experience in a Secular Age. Dr. Allison, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's jump right into it because as I said, this is very interesting, very exciting because you're touching on the other realms, the way I would put it. Would you like to start out just explaining what prompted you to write this piece?
Well, that's very difficult because there are multiple answers. One answer is that I've always been interested in the topics in this book, but really didn't have the courage or didn't feel the freedom to write about them. So now that I'm older and I've done the things I want to do, and I don't have to face any more promotion committees, right? I have tenure, full professor, all of that sort of thing. I no longer really care what people think about me anymore, so I can finally be honest in ways that I haven't. So that's part of it. But the other thing is that this book grows out of my own personal experiences. So it's a book about so-called religious experiences. And as I relate in the book, I've had a number of those. And these are the sorts of experiences that have never left me, that they've always been there. They have greatly influenced my life. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to understand them. And the way I try to understand everything, whatever it is by looking for parallels and doing comparison. So I've spent a lifetime looking for parallels to my own experiences and gathering data and so on. So part of it is just my own experience leads to the subjects in this book. And part of it is I can say what I want now, given where I am, in my academic path. A few of these paragraphs actually come from a book I wrote 30 years ago, but at that point, I did not have a full-time appointment. I was teaching as an adjunct, and I thought, I just can't publish this sort of thing, right? Because there are so many people within the guild, my academic guild, so many professors who just won't understand and will be unsympathetic. So I just wrote this book and then put it away. I never did anything with it. And when I finally came back to this book, I realized there were some paragraphs and a couple of pages in that other book that I could adapt and put into this thing. It mattered then what other people thought about me. It doesn't matter so much anymore. If that makes sense to you.
That makes a lot of sense, and you touch on that in your book. I have read it, and I have so many questions, so I have to be organized.
Okay.
Since you spoke about that topic, I'll go to that in my questioning. I had that question in the lineup, but it wasn't my top question. However, let me ask you, why do you think, I'm going to go to the people who believe. We'll set aside the academic world. You talk about the people who believe, like the church. Why do you think even they, of all people or all groups, why are they so skeptical?
Well, so first of all, I think you have to draw a line here. So there are different churches and different types of churches. So we do have within the Christian tradition charismatic movements, right? Charismatic churches and groups of Christians that are more open to some of the things that this book talks about. But there's a very strong Protestant tradition, especially mainstream Protestant tradition, of rejecting miracles and visions and extraordinary claims. And it grows in large part out of the Reformation. So when the Protestants got started, they attacked Catholicism. They were separating from Catholicism, and Catholics had lots of visions and they had lots of miracles, and they were very good at casting out demons, and Protestants weren't. And so Protestants very early on came up with rationalizations for all the Roman Catholic miracles. And you actually end up very early on in Protestantism with a doctrine known as cessationism, which is the notion that miracles stopped. Miracles stopped when the Bible was finished, or they stopped when the apostles died, or when the last book in the New Testament was written. And that means they explained away everything unusual or weird or strange or extraordinary that's between the New Testament and their own day. And that tradition has continued on and has been very influential in the churches. I also think that that the churches are not, especially the mainline churches, they're not immune to the influence of modern secular thought and modern materialism and reductionistic science, which tries to explain everything away that's not welcome to its own universe. So modern liberal mainline churches, at least here in the States, don't talk much about the sorts of things in this book. And lots of people are just very uneasy about these sorts of things. They would rather focus on other things, ethics or social issues or political issues or charity. They're very comfortable in what you might call the ethical realm, or the social realm, or the political realm. But the realm that I deal with in this book, I know lots of people who just don't want to go there, and they think that when you go there, something may be not quite right about you. So I'm sure that I have friends and people in the academy who will talk about me now behind my back, right? That's just the way it is. It's okay. They're talking behind my back. So as long as they do that, I don't know what they're saying, and it's not going to bother me. But I know that will go on. Look, my whole training as an academic was to explain away everything that's miraculous or unusual. I was educated into that tradition, both philosophically and historically, and have lived most of my life in that mainstream academy. So I don't quite fit.
Well,
and go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
I was just going to add that I don't care if I don't fit anymore. Okay, that's it.
Well, Jesus didn't fit.
Well, yeah, he got in trouble too, right?
Well, but he for at the end of the day, fitting in isn't always the best, and it isn't always right. So now I'm going to put the academic world back on the table, and that because you said they're talking behind your back. What I'd like to do myself is look at what is going on in science, especially specifically quantum physics. And yes, I see you smiling. It's so interesting. In your book, you also mention, excuse me if I'm paraphrasing this incorrectly, but science tries to explain away, I shouldn't say away, explain why we have these supernatural phenomenal experiences. Now, quantum physics, for me, if I have to pick one, I always lean toward quantum physics, because to me, it looks like, oh, well, you are, everything you make fun of, science, you're starting to see, oh, wait, this is scientific, or this is real. Talk to us about that, how science is trying to catch up, I guess, with the phenomenal and the spiritual.
Well, so again, I'm not sure I want to speak about science, you can speak about different sciences or maybe different branches of science.
Okay.
If you're talking about quantum mechanics, then you're talking about something that I don't understand, but I feel okay about that because I've actually talked to some physicists, and
Awesome.
they will tell me things like they don't really understand what's going on. I remember a conversation with somebody who worked at Los Alamos and, you know, had written a couple of physics textbooks and knew what he was talking about. And he said, I have no conception of what's going on, you know, down there. I know how to do equations, you know, for bubble chambers, but I can't conceptualize what's going on. So if I understand it, and of course, you know, I'm just an amateur who I read a book on physics once in a while. But if I understand it, the old materialism does seem to be passé. The idea that everything is solid and we understand it is gone. They will talk about things like waves of probability. And
Right.
I can't even figure out what that means, right? But they think it means something. It's as though the whole world has somehow, I don't know, become something truly weird and incomprehensible, right? When you get down to the lowest stuff or you get to the biggest stuff, the mind just can't take it in. So I guess that comforts me in the sense that I think the people who are sure that they can explain everything must be wrong, because it doesn't look like they can even explain, you know, ordinary quantum physics or science. Again, if you read the literature, you'll see that there are all sorts of different theories or interpretations of the experiences or the experiments. How do we understand this? How does the wave collapse? Does it collapse at all? You know, all these questions. So all it does for me is it makes me think, well, the old-fashioned materialism is gone. I don't understand exactly what's replaced it, but I wasn't comfortable in the old materialistic world, and I'm not sure that I have to worry about it in the way people did before, right? And I still think a lot of skepticism is at home in the older materialism, in what William James called medical materialism. We can explain everything in terms of chemicals and electricity and little pieces of matter. That doesn't seem to be the case, in part because nobody knows what little pieces of matter are anymore. It just doesn't make sense. I've sometimes told people, I don't know who I am anymore. At least I don't know what my body is. Is this waves? Once you say I'm waves of probability, I've just lost it. I don't know what the heck I am.
Okay, thank you. You said a word. Sorry about that. I was trying to unmute. You said a word, and that word is a word I use often, conceptualize. My take is that we conceptualize the Almighty God, the Most High. We cannot fully understand God, the unfathomable God is what I say.
Yes.
The mystery. So when I heard you say conceptualize about ourselves, that's for me microcosm, and then we think of the macrocosm, God.
Yeah.
Talk to us about the concept of God.
Well, I'm on board with what's known as apophatic theology. So I do not know what God is in God's self. I really can't do this. And if you look at traditional Christian liturgies, for example, they are full of phrases like God is incomprehensible and God is beyond understanding. God is a mystery. That word's all over the place. Everything is a mystery. So I plug into that. I think that most of our talk, maybe even all our talk about God, I'd have to think about that, is what you would call mythological. That is, we use images, we tell stories, but you just can't be literal about this omnipresent, invisible spirit. It doesn't make any sense. This deity that knows everything and lives in your heart and runs the universe. One of the things I like to think about is that the universe in its size, if you pay attention to cosmologists today, simply can't be fathomed. The size of the whole universe and what's in it is incomprehensible. And then, as I said earlier, when you get down to the lower level, submicroscopic level, we can't figure out what's going on. So it seems to me if we can't even understand the physical world, right, around us, the chance that we're going to be able to figure out the spirit that's responsible for this whole thing, that's just not going anywhere, right? And the other thing, although it's tricky and dangerous, is that I know that I'm a mammal, all right? I'm a mammal, and that means I have a mammalian brain. I really do. And if I look at all other mammals, I don't think they can figure out the universe. I don't think they can figure out God. They can't even figure out all sorts of little things that I know. And I don't think if I have this mammalian brain that I'm going to be able to figure out, the mind of God or anything like that. I'm just not going to be there, right? So I'm sort of radically apophatic. So my idea that God is a mystery actually fits everything else. Gravity is a mystery. Electrons are a mystery. Where this universe comes from is a mystery. I'm a mystery to myself, if I'm honest about it. I mean, just about everything around me is a mystery, and we have lots of explanations, and we should not in any way belittle science. But whenever you have an explanation, and you go back one or two steps, at some point, it's always, well, okay, that's just the way it is. It's just the way it is, and there's no explanation for it, right? No matter what it is. So I'm surrounded by a world I don't really understand. I can say that's a tree, and I can say the leaves are turning orange. But, if I get much beyond that, I'm flummoxed, I'm afraid.
Oh, I like that word, flummoxed. It reminds me of, who says that? One of my teachers used to say that. Okay, so, and you are a teacher. So let me get right into, now that I think it was good because we prefaced your experiences with some background on where you stand, in your beliefs. And I like how you brought it full circle, where we talked about the unfathomable God, and you came right back around and said, I'm a mystery. So that was great. So now in your book, you give us an account of different experiences, supernatural. I'm going to go out there and say it for you. Because I know you already have your colleagues back and behind your back. Oh, yes, Dale's lost it. No, he hasn't lost it. I think you found it, actually. So let's talk about the first experience that you had. It's very interesting with the stars. Please tell us about that.
So the first thing I have to do, which is in continuity with what we've just been talking about, is to say it's ineffable. That is, I can try to put it into words, but there's no perfect correlation between my speech and what really happened. And so it's almost like I'm using mythological language to talk about my own experience. So the experience you're talking about took place when I was 16 years old. I was alone. I was on my parents' back porch. I was under the Kansas night sky. This was a time and place where you could still see the stars, so I could look up and see the stars. And it was dark. I do not remember what I was thinking, but what happened to me was that in a moment, somehow out of nowhere, and this makes no sense, so you can't take it literally, but what it felt like or seemed like, or within the experience, it was as though the stars came down from heaven. I don't know what that means. I really don't. I don't know what this means, but it's the only sentence that sort of makes sense of what happens. And so with these stars or lights around me, they were like messengers announcing the arrival of something. And then this something arrived. And this only lasted maybe 20 seconds, something like that. But there's this overwhelming something. And of course, given my background and culture, the word God immediately came to mind afterwards, as soon as I tried to figure this out. But this presence that was both overwhelming and terrifying on the one hand, but loving and affectionate on the other. And again, I don't know how you put those two things together, because how do you sense this overwhelming otherness and have some kind of fear at the same time you know that this is loving and affectionate and wonderful, right? And what happened in that moment is that my world flipped, because it had always been like going to school and watching television and doing homework and playing basketball were the real things, and religion was sort of this thing you thought about. You might say your prayers, but it wasn't real in the same sense. And what flipped was the idea that whatever this was that ran into me was the real thing, the really real, and everything else was somehow not as real as that. So everything just got turned upside down. And the reason I'm talking to you today is because of that experience, because that changed my life. I wanted to think about God. I wanted to think about religion. I wanted to know what had happened to other people. I guess, you know, if you're a skeptical, cynical secularist, you would say that I became a religious fanatic then. But the truth is, I ran into, it seemed to me, the really real. And I wanted to know about the really real, not this world that seems temporal and illusory compared to that reality. So, you know, one of the things I say in the book is that you can have different opinions about what I'm talking about. I guess you could say I made it up if you want to. But one thing that is undeniable is that people have experiences like this, and they do flip their lives, they change their lives, and they're often the most important things that happen to them. I never told my parents about this. Isn't that interesting? They're in the house. I didn't go in and talk to them. I didn't know what to do with it, right? What I ended up doing within, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks was leaving my parents' church and going to a church where I thought people could talk about things like this more often. And, you know, I went to church and they told me what had happened, and, you know, they interpreted it for me. In retrospect, I don't think they interpreted it correctly, but at least I could talk to them about this. It was a conservative evangelical church, and they were all into being born again. So they tried to plug my experience into being born again and meeting Jesus and all of that. At least I could verbalize or try to verbalize what had happened to me. So that's where it all gets started. That's actually why I ended up majoring in religion in college. And then eventually I got a PhD in early Christianity and Bible, because studying the Bible was part of my quest to figure out what the heck was this that I ran into. And still to this day, I think that, which I will call God, I think that is real. That's the real reality. And, you know, this computer and my body and all the rest of it, that's somehow less real on the scale of reality. Again, I don't know how to put that literally, but that's how it feels. Whoop, not hearing you. Not hearing you right now.
I always mute out so you can have, you know, this best audio. So thank you. So you put that very well, and I would like to ask you, I didn't see in the book you cover what happened before that. That's what I'm thinking. I was wondering.
Nothing.
What
Absolutely nothing. Nothing. So that's part of the. That's part
Dr.
of
Allison, what were you doing before that, though?
I was just sitting thinking. I was just a teenager sitting and thinking.
Wow. What were you thinking about?
I don't remember, probably about school or played basketball or some mundane thing like that. So this was between my junior year and senior year of high school. So who knows? Maybe I was thinking about girls. I have no idea. The point was, it came out of the blue. I wasn't seeking it. I wasn't thinking about it. It's just, how the heck did this happen? It's a little like, I don't know, our ideas of Paul's experience on the Damascus Road. It's kind of like the way it's depicted in Acts anyway. It just happens out of the blue. It's not that he does it or is trying to have it, right? You know, people can seek experiences. You can seek experiences through meditation or drugs or this or that, through prayer. I wasn't doing any of those things.
I believe you.
So that's why the Christian doctrine of grace resonates with me, because this was a gracious experience. It just came out of nowhere. I didn't earn it or deserve it or do anything. It's just happened to me. And experiences like this often are just random, and people who don't have them sometimes feel jealous, but there's no accounting for why some people have this sort of experience and others don't.
Well,
I have no
Now,
explanation.
so now we know, though, we know you were just doing what teenage boys do, thinking about whatever, food, girls,
Yeah, whatever. Sports.
Okay, well,
yeah.
All right. So that experience took place, and again, in your book, you do cover that information, the information about how it is life changing, and I just, you know what? Let's just get all of them out of the way, because I think this is the juicy part for me. Let's move forward. So that happened to you as a teen. I think you said you're 15 or 16.
Yeah. Yep.
Then you have another experience.
So
And for me, I'm going to let you know. By the way, I've had all of this happen to me.
Okay.
I just want to throw it out there.
So
Not the
actually,
same experience, but similar.
Yeah. So one of the things that I say in the book at the beginning of chapter 2, after talking about my own experiences, is there's nothing special about me, because the sorts of things that have happened to me are happening to lots and lots of people. And that's part of the book. Part of the book is, as a reporter, just to say, you know what? If you pay attention, these sorts of experiences are happening to people all around, all the time. There must be some kind of censorship in our society that we don't all know this, right? So
yeah, and that's what I was going to get into. Talk to us about how the research on all the other people before. I mean, we might as well. We're going to get to the other experience, but talk to us about the research, the extensive research that has been done, especially in the UK.
Yeah.
I think they have some society called the Paranormal Society. It's a part of Oxford.
Oh, okay. So you're thinking of a project that was founded by a biologist named Alistair Hardy, which started at the University of Oxford. It's now at the University of Wales right now. Okay. But it's a project that for a little over 50 years now has been collecting stories from people. And these are stories of people having visions or having experiences like mine, sometimes people encountering what they call evil, you know, some invisible, oppressive something. It includes people seeing what they call angels and so on, and near-death experiences, all the experiences that I talk about in this book. And one of the things, well, there are two things that come out of this research and research that follows it. One is the widespread reality of these experiences, even in a so-called secular age, right? Or even in secular Britain, people who are not religious and not going to church and so on are still reporting these things. The other neat thing about all this data is that it's sort of like doing natural history. That is, once you have all this stuff, you can begin to have piles. That is, okay, here's experience A, and we'll put all experiences that are B over here and C. And once we have these different experiences, we can start making generalizations about them. We can talk about triggers that might lead to them. We can make generalizations about gender, whether this experience is more common with women or men, and all these things. But the point is, people have been collecting data. Psychologists and others have been collecting data on these experiences now, so that we know a lot about them. It's not like this is just a mess and we just have a bunch of stories and nobody has any idea what's going on. We now have enough stuff that we can make some generalizations about it. So I think that's what you're talking about, what you're getting to. And that's the first purpose of the book, just to say, look at all these scholars, researchers, social psychologists, students of religion, and so on, who've been doing surveys and interviewing people and all the rest of it. And look at all the stuff they've discovered about what's going on. Also, one of the major things in my book, which I call, the pastoral imperative, is that once you read all this stuff, you realize that the people reporting this, for the most part, are just normal people. That is, I'm not crazy. There's nothing wrong with me. I don't have any mental debility. I'm sure you don't either, right? Even though you're sitting here saying you have experiences like mine. Actually, some of the research shows that people who have metanormal, religious, paranormal experiences are a little bit healthier than people who don't. Anyway, there's no evidence that experiencing the sorts of things I talk about in the book are a sign of anything to be worried about. Of course, there are, people with mental debilities who have visions and so on, but they are the exception. They are not the rule. The rule is that healthy people, tons of healthy people have visions. Tons of healthy people hear voices. Some of these voices are guiding voices that tell them things that turn out to be very helpful. It's very weird. It's very strange, but it's common. It's just common, right? And you can just say, well, people have guardian angels, or people have good hunches, or whatever the interpretation. The point is, before you get to the interpretation, you just have to know that the phenomenon is real and it's common. And so almost everything in the book, there may be an exception or two, but everything in the book is just well documented. And so whatever the explanation, the first thing is that subjectively people are reporting these things and have been reporting them in great numbers. And they're not going away because we're secular, and they're not going away because people aren't going to church.
Wow, thank you. When you say, you're exactly right. It's like in our culture, especially Western culture, we are so quick. When I say we, not you and I, and not this group, but as a community, as a whole, as a society, we're so quick to say, oh, right, you're so crazy. Oh, you're spooky. Yeah. And so many people are experiencing it. In fact, there is a part of your book where you talk about there was a group gathered, and they were asked, they had lost their spouses, and they were, yeah. Talk about that, how everybody was like, most of them were like, oh, not me. And then at the end, they were half the group was like.
So this was, I'm trying to remember, it might've been Denmark, but there were some social psychologists who went to a nursing home, or maybe it was more than one nursing home, and they had some anecdotal data about people hearing a departed loved one, or seeing a departed loved one, or feeling the presence of a departed loved one. And they wanted to get some idea of how common this experience was. And so they went out and they asked their questions. And if I recall rightly, I'm trying to remember the number. Maybe it was 50 people that they initially interviewed. And one person said, yes, I've encountered my dead husband, right? And they thought they had enough anecdotal evidence that that just couldn't be right. It can't be 2% of the population, right? So they thought about what they had done and how they'd approach these people and how they asked the question. And so they went back and did it again. And what happened this time was, before they asked the question, they prefaced it with, we are going to ask you a question, and if you answer yes, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you, and it doesn't mean you're crazy, and we think this is a pretty common experience. It may be a common part of the mourning process. So what they did is they told them ahead of time that if they said yes, they wouldn't be crazy and they wouldn't be made fun of. And then it went from 2% to 50%. That is, half of the folks said, yes, I've seen or heard or felt the presence of my departed spouse within the first year of death. So that's really profound. That's really profound, because it tells you that there was a self-imposed censorship. And that's another theme of the book. I start several chapters with quotations from people who just say, I didn't tell anyone, or I only told my husband, or I didn't tell anyone until now. And I give some examples of that too, of people who had really life-changing experiences, changed their view of reality, experiences that were maybe the most important thing that ever happened to them, and they never told anybody till 40 years later or 50 years later. My favorite was a woman who kept her experience private for 90 years. She was in her late 90s and finally told someone about the near-death experience she'd had when she was a little girl. So that's unbelievable, isn't it? It's unbelievable that we have this sort of censorship. And I've also experienced this myself. So once people find out that I'm open-minded, I get stories, but they tell me these stories when I'm alone with them. They don't, raise their hand in a group and share. And they frequently preface their comments with, well, I only told my wife, or I've never told anybody, or that sort of thing, right?
Wow.
It's as common as it can be for near-death experiences or visions of angels, or running into evil, or feeling this transcendent affection or love that so many people say they experience. In our time and place, many of us still just keep these to ourselves. There is some evidence that since the 1960s, we are a little more open-minded society, but there's still an implicit censorship in important areas of our culture, including, importantly for me, many churches, right?
Wow, yes. And when you say keeping it to ourselves, in your book, so this is a personal thing about you, but you put it in your book, your child, because you said scary, that we're talking about the beautiful side.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about what you mentioned, your daughter, how she was, what her experience and how she kept it to herself?
Well, so that experience is so weird, and it didn't happen to me, that I don't really know how to relate it. But I'll just say that one morning when she woke up, she saw these very frightening shadow things around her bed. All right. And it sounds okay, shadow beings. Well, I wasn't there, but she was petrified out of her mind. And two things about this. One is she came to me that very morning and she told me what happened right after it happened. And I remember her saying, "Dad, don't tell anyone because they'll think I'm crazy." All right. That's the first thing. And then just a few years ago, she told me that she had post-stress traumatic syndrome, right? And for 10 years, this experience haunted her so much. By the way, also in this book, I have the story of my son having a vision of a very, I don't know what the heck to call it. He's not sure what to call it, but he also had some experience a little while back of encountering some sort of I don't, yeah, what are the words for these sorts of things? But some sort of shadow, some sort of being, some sort of force, something that hated him and that wished him ill, and that was absolutely terrifying. So he wrote this up in an email, and I put it in the book. And recently, when somebody asked him to talk about it for a podcast, he simply said no. He said, I don't want to go back there. I don't want to relive it. I just want to run away from it. So, whatever it is, and by the way, he's not, he doesn't belong to any religious organization or group. He doesn't go to a church. He's not religious in the way I am. But he thinks he ran into some kind of evil being or evil spirit, and it was petrifying. And one of the really surprising things about my research is that I'm pretty sure, after having read into this, that 20 to 30% of modern people in Europe and in the United States, at least once in their lifetime, have an experience of running into something horrifically evil. And some of them will say, I used to think Satan was a myth, that kind of thing, but now I don't. So they pick up traditional religious language to interpret the experience. My son didn't do that. But the point here is that phenomenologically, whatever the explanation, whether chemicals, electrons, whatever's going on, people, at least subjectively, have these experiences, which I think probably historically have contributed to the belief in Satan and demons and so on. People don't just sit around and make up religious ideas. They are usually trying to figure out something that happened to them or to somebody else, right? They're trying to make sense of the world. Anyway, the point is that, yeah, not everything is just sweetness and goodness. Sometimes, actually, a lot people run into weird, very frightening things that aren't normal.
Well, there is an account worldwide. There are accounts, I should say, worldwide of this entity. First off, in our family, my family, they call it the Bigfoot demon. And
Okay.
I know it sounds funny. It's a big, shadowy, heavy presence. And you can hear about it like, there's Slender Man, the same thing, like this terrifying presence. And in Japan, I forgot what it's called. It's another very tall, terrifying presence. So it's something, everybody's not just getting together and saying, okay, guys, we're going to talk about this presence. It's going to be very, very heavy, and it's going to be dark and shadowy. So it is something.
Yeah. And so that's the case with lots of these things. It's not obvious to most of us that God is love. It's actually a bit counterintuitive given the world. And so you can ask, why did anyone ever come up with this idea? Maybe it has something to do with the fact that people have this experience of transcendent love overwhelming them. Or why do people, for example, think traditionally that maybe angels show up and take you, to the other world when you die? I think it's because people on their deathbeds have visions of luminous figures. We actually, it's not, I think, we know this now. And also, why do we have this notion that in the afterlife you spend the time with your relatives? Well, it's because in part, people on their deathbeds have visions of their relatives coming for them. I could go on and on. Why do we have this belief in hell? It is a horrible belief. I don't like it. But if you look at near-death experiences, a certain percentage of them, I don't know, 5% or whatever, are not wonderful. They're actually terrible and hideous. And the people experience things like the outer darkness, you know, a phrase you find in the New Testament. So again, I don't think people are making these things up. I don't think they're just spinning doctrines out of nothing. I think they're trying to understand what has happened to them. So you're right. I have no idea what Slender Man is or this weird Bigfoot thing you're talking about.
Yeah.
But I do know that human beings in various times and places have visions of these shadow things that radiate some sort of evil or hatred. And that now we can then go on and ask, what is it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, a certain sort of person might say, okay, we're going to figure this out because it's a glitch in your brain, right? It has to do with something over here and the chemicals. But I'm open to thinking that maybe it's more than that, and it's maybe something beyond our current reductive science.
Wow, yes. And it can't just be my brain because your son experienced it, your daughter, the people in Asia. So it's not just our brains. We know this. We know
Yeah.
this. You know, talking at this time of year, I'm laughing. I'm smiling because I don't know, maybe I need to, no, I do need to sit down with you another time, maybe off camera. I have a very strong understanding, not even a belief, understanding about the different times of year. And during this time, you know, October, the fall, autumn, it's when the earth or when everything is quieting down. And I say the veil is thinning. And because of that, this is just my personal experience. I haven't really done the research, but more, I guess, spiritual visions and sightings and phenomenal experiences take place during this time. And so I'm trying to move into your experience at the cemetery, looking at the cemetery. So especially when you're around graveyards and cemeteries, you can see a lot of phenomenal activity. Talk to us about your experience.
Okay, I will. But first of all, I'll just say that, you know, people are different. So I just hate winter. I just hate it. I grew up in Kansas. I like the warmth. I like summer. And so, you know, when it turns winter, I just say God has gone away or God's on vacation.
Wow.
And God will come back into spring, right?
Okay.
I actually don't know how to respond to your comments about time because that's not something I've researched. I do know that it's common all around the world in both folklore and religion to think that there are places. Now you're talking about times, but there are also people have believed places where certain things are more likely to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we certainly do have lots of legends and folklore, superstition, whatever, about graveyards, right? But
Yeah.
my graveyard experience, to which you're referring, was wonderful. It was not terrible. And so this is my experience of walking by a window. I'm in my apartment, and here I'm in my early 20s, 22 maybe, something like that. And my apartment overlooked a graveyard, which I thought was wonderful. So it was always quiet, and there were beautiful trees and plants and all the rest of it. But what happened, and this is really common, this experience is really common. I found parallels to this almost instantly, just opening up a couple of books. But what happened is it was as though the face of the world sort of fell away, and I saw what was really under it, or what the leaves really were, and what the grass really was, and what the stones really were. And everything sort of changed color and became translucent and sparkling. Everything was like crystals, beautiful diamonds, new colors. And the sense, this lasted, I'm sure this was less than 10 seconds. It might have been 5 seconds. But inside this experience, I again felt reality flip. It was like, I'm actually seeing what's really there all the time, but I'm usually just blind to it. It's not as though nature changed, but somehow my eyes changed just for a second so that I could see what's already there or what's always there. And the thought that came inside of it was, wow, this is still Eden. We just don't know it, and we're always blind, right? That was the thought. That's how my mind instantly interpreted this thing. But that's really common. It is really common to see the natural landscape flip or switch or turn and become this unexpected, glorious, transcendent something, and to feel this magical presence in it. So my first experience, when I talked about under the night sky, that felt what you might call theistic. That is, I naturally just thought God, right? This is the ultimate something. This was, you don't have to be a theist to have this experience or even interpret it that way. It was just like I was seeing something in a way I'd never seen it before, and it was profound, and it was overwhelming. And again, it was the flip thing. Oh, that's real. Usually I'm just blind. You know, by the way, all this stuff is a little bit like Plato's cave. It's like we really are in this cave most of the time. And once in a while we get a glimpse of the light that's outside the cave, right? And we mistake the little shadows on the wall inside the cave for reality. But the greater reality is something out there and beyond that, we're usually not plugged into. We just get these glimpses, these inlets of other things outside of us, at least for most of us. Microphone again.
I know I'm unmuting. You know, that I have heard with accounts of people will recount their NDE, their near-death experience. And I don't really, for me, it's not really near death. It is actually they die and they are resuscitated, so death experience. But I was trying to remember the neuroscientist. He talks about how when he was in that state, the colors, he couldn't describe the beauty of the nature, like the water, the plants. Have you heard of I think it's Dr. Alexander.
Eben Alexander. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he's quite a controversial and colorful figure, but yes, he did have a near-death experience, and it changed him radically. And he's been focused on that and related things ever since. But natural landscapes, where you see colors that you haven't seen before, or you see the world transformed, or you have these beautiful visions, those are part of many so-called near-death experiences. They're also part of some deathbed visions where people, aren't dead, but they're getting close to dying, kind of like the veil is thinning, and they're seeing things that they hadn't seen before, or maybe didn't even believe in before. But yeah, that's again. So we have all these images of heaven. We've got streets of gold and, different kinds of buildings and natural landscapes and gardens of Eden type, thing. And I think part of this is not just pure imagination. I think the imaginations have been fed by people having experiences and coming back and whispering to someone, this is what happened to me. This is what I saw. And experiences are feeding into ideas people have about the afterlife or God or whatnot.
I'm going to read a quote from your book.
Okay.
Where you quote Shakespeare. Such tricks had strong imagination, that if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy.
Yeah. Okay. And what do you want to ask about that?
Well, when people hear us discussing this, it's going with the context of your book, why you put that in there. The Dr. Alexander, he's a neuroscientist. You're this professor, this author, then you have these accounts, and they're real. I know they're real, but again, people are going to go back. I'm giving you a chance to really, we're going to get you solid here, and they're not going to walk away from this interview and go, wow, Dr. Allison, I don't know what he's been up to. Really talk to us about how we can convince people, in a sense, to just stop quickly going to, oh, it's their imagination, or, oh, it's this guy's mind, or this lady's probably some pseudo cuckoo anyway. What can we do?
So I don't know. That is a great question. And I really don't have the answer, because worldviews are really hard to change. It's really hard to convince people who don't want to be convinced. So one of the things that I do in the book is, when it comes to near-death experience, I've got maybe 3 pages where I'm just quoting on-the-scene medical personnel, surgeons, doctors, nurses, and so on, who were there when somebody was unconscious and or on the table being operated on, and that person then wakes up and then tells the nurse or the attendant or the surgeon, the doctor, something that the patient can't know. It's not possible, because the patient would have had to be down the hall at the time, or upstairs watching and seeing and so on. It's not possible. So I've strung a bunch of these together, and I've said, how many of these does it take, right, to convince somebody who doesn't want to believe? I'm not sure any amount would work. We actually have a book now. It was published just a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, called The Self Does Not Die. And it is a collection of these sorts of stories. That is, near-death experiences that seem to have confirmation from medical personnel who were there at the time. People who were interviewed by the authors of the book, right? And people from whom we have firsthand accounts. There are over 100 there. There are over 100 in the book. I find it really strange. I find it impossible to think that they're all lying, that they all made it up, and that they're all morons and they couldn't see the obvious explanation. So these are all people who are trained, and they're saying, I saw something I cannot explain in my traditional framework. Now, you and I might be under the illusion that that will change minds. I don't think it will. I think it's just really hard. It's really, really hard to change people's mind. So the way I look at it is this: I'm not going to change the mind of anybody who is dogmatic, but maybe I can help move somebody who's undecided or wondering or in the middle, right? Somebody whose mind is at least partially open. Maybe I could open it a little further, okay? But I'm under no illusion that I or you are going to be able to have an effect on people who are just not there, right? They just don't want to go there. They find what I'm saying or what you're saying to be wacky. They're just,
Yeah.
what are you going to do?
Yes, I think it has something to do, for some reason, not for some reason, I thought of Ebenezer Scrooge.
Oh yeah, uh-huh.
It's going to take one of those moments, for them to get, a serious personal experience of their own. And even in that story, which is awesome, Dickens shows us it changes his life. That's all, it took some type of divine intervention for him in the story. Of course, it's a piece of a fictional piece, but go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, but those events don't come to everybody, right? And there are people I know who will say, well, nothing unusual has ever happened to me or my immediate circle, right? And when that's the case, and you grow up with the sort of secular education I did, you're just not going to be very open-minded about the sorts of things we're talking about. Now, one of the things I do in the book is consistent with what you just said. That is, there are testimonies from people that I put in the book who say something like, well, I didn't believe this until, and then something happened to them, right? So there are people who have near-death experiences, and afterwards they'll say, well, I didn't believe it before it happened, but now I do. Or I didn't used to think there was an afterlife, but now I do. I had a friend who was very sick, who was dying of cancer, and he'd been on the table, he'd had some surgery done. And he talked to me one day and he said, you know what, Dale, I used to think those near-death experience stories were just bunk. They were bunk. And then he said, but I had one and now I know it's real. Okay.
Beautiful.
So I couldn't have convinced him without his experience. It just doesn't matter. So, by the way, I study religion. I know how dogmatic people can be. I know how unpersuadable people can be. It's just really hard when something doesn't fit and you don't want it to fit. You don't want it to fit. So, maybe the society is moving a little bit in a certain direction. Maybe it's moving a little bit in the direction you and I would prefer, but it's going to take a lot of time, okay?
Right.
It's going to take more than my little book and your podcast to change anything, right?
It's going to take some kind of situation where in the scriptures, during the crucifixion, the dead came out of the graves and mass knocking on the door. Hi, Mom, I'm back,
Yeah,
And
well, how often does that happen? How often does that happen?
often.
Yeah,
Not often,
okay.
but I do believe it's happening more. I want to talk to you about, because you said you are definitely a teacher of religion. You deal with people with their different doctrines and Christians. Let's talk about the Bible and Christianity and how it's been taught. Here's another program with our society. Oh, it's evil. Stay away from it. Let me show you in the Bible. See, God said that if you see spirits of your dead loved ones, those are really demons in disguise. All of that's been taught to the Christian, in large part to Christians. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, so that's hard for me to deal with because I think it's just so transparently a bunch of baloney. All right.
Yeah.
So it depends on what you're talking about. So Esoteric told me before the show about some experience recently that he had, and it spooked somebody who I assume was a pious Christian, but it was just an experience of, seeing something before it happened. And that's just completely common. And if you know it's completely common, there's no reason at all to be freaked out. You just say, well, that's interesting. Or, things like that happen. And then you move on, but you don't get scared by it. The thing with spirits and ghosts I think has to do with history. So for example, Roman Catholics had a doctrine of purgatory, right? And when Protestants came along, they had to get rid of that because that didn't fit what they believed. And so what Protestants ended up doing very quickly is teaching that when you're dead, you either go immediately to hell or you go to heaven. That became the dominant Protestant view. And then the problem was, what do you do with a ghost? Because it didn't fit. And so we know enough from history, I think, to say people continued to see ghosts in Protestant lands, but they didn't report them. And when they were reported, they were explained away. It's a demon, or you're hallucinating, or something is wrong with you. So there's actually a tradition that grows out of Protestantism that discourages you from thinking that it's really possible to see the ghost of your dead loved one, right? And it's a very strong tradition that continues today. The other thing that comes out of the Christian tradition, and this comes from both Catholicism and Protestantism, is a belief in witchcraft, a real belief in witchcraft. Now that begins to die out in the 17th century, but the effects live on. So there has been a tendency, when you don't like something and something really strange is happening, maybe something paranormal, to say witch, or and witch in the tradition means either demon or deluded. I mean, it's you know, those are your choices there. So what I'm saying here is this actually a historical tradition. You can look at it and you can say, okay, the churches have discouraged all this stuff. And then what happens is that the secular world, or at least especially the reductive materialism of the 19th century, comes along and reinforces the doubts of the people in the mainstream churches. Things like this can't happen at all, right? And if you think they're happening, well, it's because something's wrong with you, not because something is really happening. So my way to approach this is, first of all, to say, I understand it historically. You're actually in a tradition here when you have this reflexive response to, you can't see ghosts, you can't see the future, or stay away from Ouija boards, or, you know, or whatever it is. And then you just have to sit down and talk to people and explain how, if they have the patience, how common certain things are and how they're not associated with, seeing the future is not associated with evil. It's sometimes associated with saving people's lives, you know, so you just have to talk. But again, you're not always going to be successful. Belief is really strong. Belief is really, really strong. And we all live with confirmation bias. We're always looking to reinforce what we already believe. And we're not paying a lot of attention to things that are going to trouble us. We're really good. We're really good at that. So yeah, there are ways to think about this. But again, there's no simple answer, because belief is belief. And
belief is belief. Yeah, you know, that's why I try not to use the word belief so much. I use other words because it's got such a negative connotation. Because belief, a lot of times, it's looking to me, the more I get, the more informed I become, and I mean spiritually informed. I see that a lot that we've learned. I was raised Catholic, and well, my mother, she wasn't Catholic. She was more, she used the Bible, but she was leaning toward animism. So she would be looked at as a witch. In fact, a lot of times in my life, even before I came to social media, I heard people call my mom and like a witch. And then I came to social media, and I'm a Bible believer. I use that word believer. I subscribe to a lot of information in the Bible. I hold that book as, you know, holy, but not in the sense of most Christians. Most Christians who look at me, they have called me a witch, just because I mean, what I'm talking about with you. Oh, yeah. There's a community out there. They would be like getting their pitchforks and getting ready for the bonfire, throwing, like, they are so many Christian, radical Christian groups out there. This kind of conversation is abhorrent to them, especially here too. You know, I also believe in Jesus. I believe in the resurrection, the crucifixion and the resurrection. So to hear people who are Christians, they would say, oh, these people, this is the end time. Don't you see? God, they're turning us away from the true scriptures. You know what I'm saying? So
yeah, but so I'm luckier than you are. So you're a social media person. I'm really not. Right. And you know, I do podcasts, but I asked my wife to watch them and make sure they're okay, because I can't stand listening to myself or seeing myself, and I don't pay any attention to comments at all. So I really have no direct encounter with the sorts of people you're talking about. I teach at what's called a mainline seminary, and I'm not dealing with fundamentalists or fundamentalism. And those people, would not recognize me as one of them at all. So our paths don't even cross.
Good.
And I'm happy for that. I don't know how I would deal with those sorts of things. And maybe this goes back to what I said earlier. You're just not going to convince certain people. So you have to just do what you think is right. Think your own thoughts, inform yourself, and let God take care of them, right? Although you are right, though, it does seem to me that more than I like to think, we have more fundamentalist groups and more extreme groups than maybe we had before. I don't know what causes that or what it's all about. But that's not my world.
Pardon? Yeah, and I'm glad, they remind me of like the Salem witch trials and things of such. So I'm glad you're buffered from that, and you will remain buffered, because Esoteric he's quick with the trigger finger to get rid of all the negative comments in the comment section. So now I want to ask you, you brought up, I know we're talking about your experience where you saw things while you didn't have any near-death experience in this book.
Yeah.
But I'm talking, it's still in the same category, phenomenal experiences that we have, and we can tell people about the experience. We didn't move on to the next realm. The reason I'm saying that is I want to go back to the story that when you touched on the medical profession, there is a doctor, Sam Parnia. I just want to say his name to you. Yeah. See if you know who he. Yes.
Yep, so I do.
It's actual research. I've said it. I don't know. I might have said it maybe 200 times since I've been on social media. Sam Parnia. He's a mainstream conventional medicine practicing doctor. He's not some, what they say, no, he's probably some pseudo scientist. And I say that, and just I guess to put the cherry on top, he's a doctor who's doing research on this. He's seen, hey, this is happening. I'll let you comment on that, and then we'll move on.
So I just, yes, so you read my book, but you probably didn't study the footnotes, but his name is frequently in the footnotes.
Oh, okay.
So, yes, I certainly do. I certainly do know him. And also, if you know some of these other people like Bruce Grayson, who's at the University of Virginia, he's a sensible person. He has conventional training. He's not a weirdo. He just studies these things the way you would study any other phenomenon. And this phenomenon is so strange that it has moved him to have new thoughts about the way the world is, right? And so, it's not like he started out when he was 20 and wanted to find out everything, he did. Actually, he got into this study of near-death experiences because he had a patient who was unconscious, and he was down the hall, and I can't remember, he spilled something on his tie or something, but it had nothing to do with this patient. And the patient later on reported the scene that, he could not have seen this scene, right? And so Grayson actually didn't say, oh gosh, there must be a life after death. It was just, that's weird, and I don't know how to explain it. And then later on, he began to look into other things and realized that this wasn't a one-of-a-kind coincidence. But the point is, he's also, I've talked to him, he's just a person. He's not a nut, right?
No, he's not.
So, no. So, yeah, that's just a cheap shot. A lot of the research now is just normal research, the sort that you get in psychology journals or sociology journals or whatever you're talking about. People are being interviewed and their stories are being written down, and that's what's going on, and people are trying to make sense of it. And that's what's happening with Parnia, right?
Right. And it's exciting. It's really
Uh-huh.
exciting to see that I guess the worlds, for me, the worlds are merging, science and the spiritual world, the religious. I don't really look at it so much as religious, but because it covers everyone's religion. And I want to get to that. I want to talk to you about the Muslim who might see God or have an NDE, or even not even an NDE, a phenomenal experience. And the Christian has that experience. I believe it was Sam Parnia who did say somehow there's this personalized God spin on it, like, oh, they see it in the way, like through the Islamic lens, and the
Uh-huh.
Christian sees it through the Christian lens. Can you speak to us about that, and what your take is on
So
it?
yeah, all perception is through our eyes and our memories and our experience and so on, and the categories that we have. So we perceive and we process and we remember everything with the categories that we have to hand, with our eyes, which are, human eyes, and with our culture and our language and all the rest of it. So my favorite illustration of this always goes back to two near-death experience themes. So one is the being of light that is at the end of the tunnel, right? So this occurs in lots of accounts. And I think it's the same experience reported again and again, but sometimes it's Jesus, sometimes it's God, sometimes it's an angel, sometimes it's just the light, sometimes it's a being of light. And if you want to look at Indian accounts, it can be the god of death, right? So I think people are having similar experiences, but they are perceiving and processing, and maybe as much as anything, remembering, right? In different ways. So you can actually have the same or a similar stimulus that is perceived and remembered in different ways. The other illustration of this, which I look at in the book, is that if you look at near-death accounts, they frequently have the motif of a boundary or a border. That is, people reach a point and they know that if they go on, they won't come back, and they're given a choice: you can come back now. And the border, the boundary, the barrier is described as a door, is described as a wall, it's described as a river, it's described in all sorts of different ways. But if you put these accounts together, it's really hard not to think that it's all the same thing, even though somebody somehow is seeing or remembering a door, whereas somebody else is seeing a wall, and somebody else is seeing and remembering a river. A river isn't a door. They're very different things. But I think they're all human conceptualizations of the same thing. I actually think it's obvious once you put them all together. So I personally think that even ordinary perception involves projection. It involves to some extent imagination and filling in gaps. They actually tell us now that our eyes don't see the vista that we see. We actually have blank spots that we fill in. Our brain fills in. So the other thing to add is that I think that our brains and our minds were evolved to live in this world. That's their primary task. And if there is another world, and somehow some part of you is taken out of this thing, this place, and put there, you're going to be seeing and experiencing things that you're not used to, and it's going to be all the more confusing and weird. And so you're going to have to project and use your language and use your culture and use your religion and all the rest of it to make sense of it. So yeah, you can see. So one of the things I tried in the book was, I just said, what would happen if you took 3 different people from 3 different cultures who knew nothing about an American football game. They had no idea what it was. And you put them in the stands for 10 minutes and then took them out and asked them what they had seen. I don't think you'd have 3 coherent accounts. I think some of them would say, well, it was a little like this. And somebody else would say it was a little like that. They'd be drawing on their past, their own culture, their own language to say something about this thing they didn't even understand, right? They could say, well, people were excited or they were screaming, but that's about the only thing they'd have in common. They wouldn't have any words for anything that was going on. They wouldn't know what a football was. They wouldn't know what a quarterback was. They wouldn't know what a referee was, and so on and so on and so on. So maybe that gets to your point that we can talk differently about very similar things, right? So that these things aren't going to solve our religious differences. You know, you're not going to be able to look at near-death experiences and say, this religion got it all right and that one didn't. I don't think that's going to happen.
Wow. You know, listening to you, so much is going on in my mind. Because what's happening with you, especially, I'm going to focus on you. We know this is very common, but for really what we can see, this is my take, is what happened in the beginning when we sat back and really were in tune with God and spirit. And even, you know, we talk about astrotheology, but when we just looked at the stars and we looked around and we noticed these spiritual phenomenal transcending things that transcend reality in a sense, we were in tune with it. And then this is what I say about our conceptualization of God. So it's not anything different than the beginning of the intelligent spiritual person. What I'm saying is we really have to be in tune, and you are receptive. I don't know if it started with the moment in the star situation, the star experience, but now you're open to receive spirit. And I'm gonna let you jump in. I know you want to.
Well,
But this is what I'm hearing.
You know, so I was just going to say, in the Christian tradition, you do have this beautiful image of the Garden of Eden and this memory of a time and place where things were well and so on. But the point of the narrative, sadly, is that that's gone, right? And that we fell and that we've screwed everything up. And that's the reality that we live in, right? We don't live in that Garden of Eden. Now, I think that you can catch glimpses of that. And I think that, you know, sometimes we may enter places like that. But the frustrating fact is that for most of us, most of the time, we're just here walking down the sidewalk and eating dinner, and we're not tuned into that. And maybe that's okay, because we're programmed primarily to get by in this life, right? To get by in the material world. So I think it's important that we try to see beyond the material world, but I also know that for most of us, you know, unless we're saints or extraordinary people, most of the time we're just going to have glimpses and other people's stories and a handful of experiences, right? I wish I were a saint and I had a constant, you know, beatific vision and could see the other world and so on, but that's not who I am. And I'm not in control of any of this stuff. Yeah. I'm just not.
Well, you're very humble, but what my point is, and I'm going to close, I think this will be the last, the last statement or question that I have for you. It's not really a question, but you're right. We're in a secular world. Your book is about that experience, having these experiences in a secular world. We're in a material world. We're going through souls. We're souls in a material world. So I'm going to use this quote from your book, and it's a very personal quote that you said your father asked you to read to him on his transitioning bed.
Yeah.
So as souls in this world, we get these connections with God. And I think this is it is a quote from Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem. Okay, so the soul can split the sky in two and let the face of God shine through. So close out and talk to us about that, please.
Well, first of all, that's the author's experience or the poet's experience. I've been to the place in Maine, the little mountain where she actually wrote that poem. There's a little marker up there above, not far from Camden, Maine, where she wrote that. But that was her experience, and it's been my experience, and it's been the experience of many other people that somehow, sometimes, for no reason we can control, it is as though the face of God or the divine reality or the loving affection that is somehow behind or beneath or always present here, even though we don't see it, that reality sometimes becomes real in a way that it isn't in our usual moments. And again, this is a common experience. And my dad had it, and I've had it, and the poet had it. And all I can say is I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for it.
Beautiful. Dr. Dale Allison Jr., right?
Yeah.
I always leave the junior. Sorry, I'm leaving. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful, wonderful interview. Please, everyone, go out, grab that book. Dr. Allison is you're a great author, by the way. Obviously, how many books do you have? Just let us know. How many
I don't know, 23, 24, something like that.
24 and counting, family.
But a lot of them are plodding academic books. They're written for scholars. So this book is not. And I have several books that are not, but a lot of them are. If you don't know Greek, you shouldn't even open it, right?
Wow, yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Allison. We hope to see you again soon. I would like to bring you back and talk to you about consciousness and Dr. Roger Penrose, Sir Roger Penrose, and all the other great you're going to have to start. I know you said you don't really look into, well, I think you do look into the quantum physics or the quantum theory, but I want you to maybe, I'm throwing that out there. Maybe I'll see a book from you.
All right.
About consciousness and the connection with God. Thank you so much. Peace. Thank you, Esoteric, by the way.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.